Thanks for taking the time to listen to our presentation about Lake Ontario coregonines. My name is Brian Whittle, and I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors who have contributed various points about their specific projects and research. Please reach out to them directly for more information. The fish community objectives for Lake Ontario mention protecting and restoring native fishes, specifically cisco, whitefish, and deepwater ciscos. And then in the objectives and the indicators, they talk about increasing spawning cisco populations in specific bays, as well as whitefish. Some of these bays, like the Bay of Quinte and Chameau Bay, are where most of these fishes are currently spawning. Others, like Hamilton Harbor, are places where they would be looking to restore. The research priorities, last published in 2015, mentioned characterizing cisco spawning habitat and identifying bottlenecks to restoring those populations in specific bays. The coregonine framework is an adaptive management approach to helping those agencies reach those management objectives. It follows Buzz Holling's adaptive environmental assessment and management cycle, where there's planning, an action takes place, you evaluate, and then the cycle starts over again. I think the framework has a lot of value in Lake Ontario. For one, it helps us focus. It gives us sort of a roadmap of what we know and what we don't. But also, if you think about the fishes that we've tried to restore to Lake Ontario by stocking, the list is kind of big compared to what we actually restored. One species, the deepwater sculpin, that we didn't even stock. So the coregonine framework helps us try to reach those restoration or conservation objectives in a very sort of logistical way. Today I'll be talking about sort of these four components. For each species in Lake Ontario, I'll try to mention what we know about the taxonomy or the distribution, the population trends, as well as the threats and impediments. Starting with bloater. The bloater was historically abundant in probably the early 1900s, and by 1960s or 70s was thought to be near extirpated. The reintroduction process started in 2012 with fishes collected from Lake Michigan. This image shows one of those recaptured fishes. So the taxonomy, there was a paper that showed a Lake Michigan and a Lake Huron and a Lake Ontario bloater were genetically very similar. And the distribution of the fishes that are recaptured in Lake Ontario are fairly similar to what they were historically thought to inhabit in Lake Ontario, as well as Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. A key research need is we don't really understand the spawning habitat or environmental conditions that bloater need in the lakes where they're still abundant, so it makes it even harder to figure out whether we have those conditions in Lake Ontario. From a threats and impediments standpoint, Baldwin's discussion paper about bloater reintroduction in Lake Ontario hit on all sorts of points, 36 pages of discussion, but only one paragraph on the impediments. What was mentioned then was overfishing and non-native species. If we're going to develop a population model for this fish, we're going to really need to borrow some parameters from other populations, because near as I can tell, this is the best time series that we can pull together of gillnet catch rates from the 40s, 60s, and then contemporary surveys when none have been collected. The reintroduction effort I mentioned started in 2012, and up through 2020, over 1 million fish have been stocked. The figure at the left illustrates the sizes of those and numbers in the specific years. Aaron Fisk, Tim Johnson, Dmitry Gorski are looking to do some more telemetry stocking survival studies out in Oswego. That's because the work that they've previously done have showed there's really high predation on these stocked fishes. So they're looking to see if different depths where the stocking occurs at can help that survival. Also, the framework calls for monitoring programs to be able to track the status of restorations. A paper we just put out surmises that the trawl surveys that we have in place now, the sampling locations are noted in those gray dots, is sufficient to track the restoration of bloater at low densities. You can see where we've caught them there is noted in the red points, and where they're stocked is in the blue. Moving on to lake whitefish. The lake whitefish taxonomy still needs to be resolved, but the distributions and habitat, there's been some interesting work. Sarah Beach for her master's with Bruce Tufts at the University of Queens showed that in the Bay of Quinte, if you tag fish that were spawning in the bay, there at those blue triangles, or fish that were spawning in the lake, they actually have quite different home ranges. And so there's evidence for multiple spawning populations and site fidelity. If we think about where the lake whitefish historically spawned successfully and where they spawn now, it's quite a different picture. Historic here in a paper by Hannah Schaefer shows in the green stars all the places that were described as having historic spawning populations, and then contemporary shows where the larvae are now, and you can see they're relegated to the northeastern regions of Lake Ontario in those select embayments. Helen Takata-Hemaker and John Suika from Fish and Wildlife Service are using historic commercial catch data and fitting a depletion-based model to that to try to estimate historic carrying capacity. Models are actually fitting okay for the whitefish data, and it looks like the historic carrying capacity was something around 3,000 metric tons. There's definitely some research needed on population modeling and threats and impediments of lake whitefish in Lake Ontario. You can tell from the figures at the right, the time series showing commercial catch at the top, a gillnet catch rate time series, or an April bottom trawl series. They're all painting a very similar picture that very few juveniles are being produced or none, and the population is at incredibly low levels relative to what it was in the 90s or any time before. The taxonomy for Cisco in Lake Ontario is informed by Ellen George's work in 2019, where she looked for evidence of stock structure between the Bay of Quinte and Chameau Bay spawning populations. She didn't find any, but noted that it wouldn't take many individuals moving back and forth to get the evidence she showed. It's kind of interesting, the work that Dmitry Gorsky and Alex Gatch have done tagging Cisco have showed there's actually strong site fidelity for fish tagged in Chameau Bay, but there is some moving back and forth between the bays. This figures at the right show the red colors illustrate sort of the high points of Cisco aggregation during the spawning period in Chameau Bay. Just like in Lake Whitefish, the larval survey showed a very drastic decline in the distribution or shrinking in the distribution of where Cisco are spawning in Lake Ontario. Again, the green stars show where they historically spawn, and here most of those gray points don't have any evidence of larvae in them. But again, larvae density highest in Chameau Bay and the Bay of Quinte. There are, however, some fish down there along the southern shore embayments, suggesting that maybe when populations are high, that a small proportion of fish are straying into historical regions. Alternatively, those areas have had some experimental stockings from Cisco, and so not quite sure which of those is to account for those larval fish we saw in 2018. The time series of these fish, this is from a recent paper from a few coregonine symposia ago. The time series basically show that bottom trawls do a decent job of tracking juvenile abundance, and then gillnets track adult abundance fairly well after that. The thing to recognize is while catch rates have seen a recent increase, 2014 year class is believed to be pretty big. That's happened before, and Cisco didn't come back. So one thing to think about is just because things are going up again, the history of these species is to have extreme year class variability. So not get too excited when we see a population on the rise. Threats and impediment. John Fitzsimons and Bob O'Gorman published a report that did a similar thing to the Baldwin paper, but actually ranked impediments from experts. Here are the top 5. Spawning stock was the highest. Genetic diversity and planktivores followed after that. The expert ranking of knowledge gap is interesting because we have pretty decent evidence now to show that there is high spawning site fidelity. And in fact, we recently, Alex Gatch published a paper pulling together all of our diet information from Cisco and Lake Ontario, and they consume a lot of predatory cladocerans. The final piece that we'll talk about with threats and impediments is the work that my group has been doing on figuring out how specific egg deposition is. Here, the different colors show the substrate types, and the x-axis is depth, and the y-axis is egg deposition rate in eggs per meter squared. You see some incredibly high deposition rates over these rocky shoal areas, especially those areas covered in dracaenid shells. What's interesting is we were able to get out in the spring of 2021 and estimate the larval emergence pattern, and we see it follows. While there were high densities in that sort of 2 to 4 meter range, what's interesting is while there were coregonine eggs sort of all over the bay out on the silt areas, we actually got no emergence in those regions. So definitely more evidence for the threats and impediments. So in conclusion, the Joint Strategic Plan for Management of Great Lakes Fishes lays out sort of what the objectives are and what the points are, and then this coregonine framework fits in right at that point to try to figure out how best to do it. I think it has a lot of value. Given the track record we've had with native species restoration in Lake Ontario, it's probably smart to take a little bit more careful, judicious approach when we attempt to restore these or conserve these other species. Thank you.